Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance will include Starbucks coffee, antediluvian puppies, and an exploration of the duality of man as we discuss all things mermaids here on Created Things. Ahoy there, listeners, and welcome to Created Things, a podcast of Catholic creatives, and the only podcast that I would argue is the essence of wetness.
Ooh.
I am psychotherapist and artist Jacob Flores Popchek. With me is my good and excellent friend, medievalist and Dominican Catholic priest, Father Gabriel Torretta. How you doing today, Padre?
I mean, yeah, swimming in the essence of wetness. Yeah.
Have you seen Zoolander?
I have seen Zoolander many times. Yes. Yes.
Moisture is the essence of wetness, and wetness is the essence of beauty.
Yeah, this is.
You know,
I feel about this.
Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. What?
Well, no. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
You're good. That's
Yep.
it. You just feel something.
I
about
feels.
it? All
Yeah.
right. I was going to ask you because I introduced you as, I don't remember already if I got the Catholic or the Dominican in the right order. I always screw up your intro, but I have found, especially when we were planning the wedding, that you, of course, celebrated our wedding, that a lot of people assume by Dominican priest, I mean a priest from the Dominican Republic.
Yes, this is.
And not a priest of the Order of St. Don. Is that something that you get a lot?
All the time. One of my good friends is a Dominican from Poland. And when the Dominicans from Poland set up in New York City, they needed to set up themselves up as a corporation, like a legal corporation, so that they could have, whatever bank accounts and stuff like this. And so they went to this part where they were living, which is, a few blocks away from a very heavily Dominican neighborhood. So they walk into the bank, and there are these two kind of roly-poly Polish dudes. And they said, we will set up a corporation with the name of
set the bank for my wife
with the name of Polish Dominicans Inc. And they, the people at the bank teller were just so confused. It's like, who are you? There is no such thing as a Polish person from the Dominican Republic. So who are you? Yeah, this is a big problem. Until I turned off all of the Gmail Google ads, I was quite frequently, because they looks at keywords in your email and then gives you these automated email ads from them. I was all the time getting emails about the advertisements on the sidebar about would you like to meet some sexy Dominican ladies?
Oh, wow. Would I ever?
It's I say mass for Dominican ladies, but I'm not looking for them as sexy Dominican ladies.
Well, that's got to happen, because isn't there also an order, I forget which order, that has their training in Jamaica, New York, which is a thing, apparently. There's a little
there is a
section
Jamaica, New York, which is always delightful. Of course, everyone always talks about going to Jamaica, and it's hilarious.
But
you're
there's
right.
an order.
I'm
there's an order that has its house there, and they always basically prank the Postons by saying that they're getting stationed in Jamaica.
And then, of course, they're getting stationed in Jamaica. Nobody wants to go to Jamaica. Yeah, right. Exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason we're talking about all this islandy stuff, and also why I opened with this, merman-centric Zoolander quote, is because, I'll start it this way. A couple months ago, I went to the Orange County Regional History Museum. It's this delightful little museum that traces kind of the history of Florida from the native peoples through, the parks. But they were running this exhibit, and this is the reason we went, on the history of magical creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And they had statues, they had rare artifacts, all these, things on the history of I think specifically the exhibit was called Giants and dragons and unicorns, but they also had fairies, and they also had the Loch Ness Monster, and they also had, just so much cool stuff. And I'm insofar as I'm a armchair medievalist, I am definitely an armchair folklorist all the more. And so I was very, into going to seeing this, and I'm walking through, and what do I find? But they have a page, which I assume was not a photocopy, but like a recreation, a page from the Nuremberg Bible, 1483. This big, beautiful spread, illuminated with gorgeous, watercolor over the hide and everything, and it's of Noah's Ark. And there are a couple of really interesting things about this Noah's Ark art. First, that the Ark itself is kind of rendered as a cathedral.
Oh, cool. Yeah, great.
Which is really cool. All the birds in the sky, all the waves. But what's most notable is the very, very obvious presence of mermaids all over this painting.
Are the mermaids in the Ark? Because I feel like that's wasting space in the Ark.
I know. No, they're not. They're outside of the Ark.
Thank God.
And they are playing with their mer dogs.
Yes, holy. Okay, wait a second. Which part is dog and which part is mer?
So, well, this is going to get us into a whole thing, but basically mer dogs are essentially, it seems like let me hold off on answering that question. That when I saw this art, I immediately wanted to do a whole episode on mermaids in Christian art, because it turns out there's a lot of mermaids in Christian art specifically. And that's funny for me, because I'm the guy behind the scenes who's always like, we should do like fewer explicitly Christian episodes and do a few more like just general art episodes. And Father Gabriel's normally the one, surprise, surprise, who wants to lean more towards the liturgical or the religious stuff. And here I am being like, I just want to talk about mermaids and religious art because it's ludicrous. And little did I know when I pitched this topic that Father Gabriel and I would end up doing more research for this episode. I mean, personally, I've done more research for this episode than I've done for any other episode, and I have less information than when I started.
Oh, it's amazing.
Mermaids in Christian art is such a Pandora's box of bullshittery that is just never ending. I feel like that scene in Spy Kids 2 where they're just in the endless falling tunnel. It's insane. And mer dogs are just the tip of that iceberg, which basically mer dogs are a very big thing whenever mermaids in the Middle Ages appear. And it seems like mer dogs are just what medieval people thought otters were.
Otters! Oh my gosh! Otters!
So they see otters and they're like, this is a dog. It's got to have a leash on it. And it's a sea dog. And so this is a pet of a mermaid, which honestly, that logic follows for me.
Yeah, that ought to work.
Oh, get wrecked. Yeah. That's awful.
No, you knew it was going to happen. Don't you dare bring up otters and think I'm not going to make that ought work pun. Don't you dare.
Yeah, but anyway, that's just the tip of the weirdness with, otters being merdogs. And anyway, we'll post the image, but it's this really gorgeous. I mean, I recommend you look it up. Nuremberg Bible, 1483, and just all of these merfolk hanging out, singing, cavorting. They don't look particularly upset.
Well, they are frankly, they are the people in the whole world who are probably least upset about this whole situation because,
right.
Honestly, this is more territory, like more real estate for them to hang out in.
This is a net win for them. Yeah. Net win for them and for their sea puppies.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing.
Yeah, their sea puppies / otters.
Well, let me offer as another food for the expansion of the heart. Also from the 1480s, in point of fact, another thing to think about. So you give this great example of, so in a Bible, right? Like in a Bible, you have an image of mermaids, and mermaid's best friend frolicking around in the sea, which does make some sense actually. But there's also this amazing image that I found from a church in Denmark, an island off of Denmark, called, it's M, the O with the line through it, N. So Mern, I'm not really sure how it's pronounced. Anyway, the church
I think I found the same image.
Yeah, the church is called Fanefjord. So it's just Fanefjord, if you want to look it up. Fanefjord.
Okay.
So it's from about 1480, or these images are from about 1480, although the church itself is older and it's all internally decorated with all these really beautiful and really wild kind of frescoes. And it has this whole marvelous cycle of like the creation of the world. And so there's this one really beautiful painting that's really quite marvelous on a ceiling. So it's sort of shaped by the little nook of the ceiling that is in. And a lot of it is pretty much exactly what you expect. So it has God creating, and as is common in certain kinds of artistic representation of in the Middle Ages of the creation, God creating the world appears sort of physically, and he looks very much like you'd expect Jesus to look. So he's wearing a long robe, and he has a beard, and he has a halo with a cross in it.
Sure.
And he's raising his hands in blessing to bless the world that he's creating. And this particular scene represents God creating the sea creatures. So it's got all the sea creatures you'd expect. It's like lobster, check. Crab, check. Fish, check. Mermaid on a rock, check. Just hanging out. You got a mermaid sitting on a rock. In fact, she's the most prominent feature there, because you've got like a lobster who is lobster size, and you got a crab who's crab size, and then you have like a mermaid who is mermaid size sitting on a rock. With her dugs kind of hanging out, with her hands upraised, looking just super happy to be being created by God. And that's that. God looked, and behold, the mermaid was good.
Yeah, the mermaid is good. So actually, I like that you're bringing this up, because this is a really important thing that I discovered kind of in my preliminary research, which is that, I think we have as modernists this idea that, if it's in not just Christian art, but kind of religious art of any religion, whether we're talking about, and we will probably have to touch on like Hindu art and Aztec art here, because there's a lot of that. But there's this bias that says that if it's in religious art, it's got to symbolize something. And I started off with that bias. I was like, okay, what do mermaids represent in Christian art? Was sort of where I went with this. And that's not to say that sometimes they don't represent things, but that's not where it starts, right? That is actually a very modern notion, I think. I'm realizing that what actually is happening here is that most people are just kind of assuming that, of any culture and any religious background, most people are just kind of assuming mermaids are real. Mermaids are just a thing. They're just a thing. And so anytime symbolism is brought to them where they're saying, oh, a mermaid represents this, or maybe an origin story is brought to them, like this Hindu god or this saint or this thing, did this with a mermaid. It's always sort of after the fact. It's always trying to explain why this creature exists, but the creature's existence is taken as fact, as opposed to kind of the other way around, which is what we assume. And that was really, really surprising to me. So the fact that in this creation image, where the mermaid isn't representing, some moral thing, the mermaid isn't representing some, ontological or spiritual truth that they're going to carve into the side of the church or something. It's literally just, look at God creating the ocean. Yeah. Obviously a mermaid would be there.
Obviously he creates everything that's in the ocean, including the obviously existing, we all know about this is not an argument, mermaids. Right. I think it's, So I will push back just a little bit on that, because like particularly in many periods of Christian art making, there is no distinction. You can't really draw a distinction between like, does something like quote just exist, or like is it symbolic? Because
sure. No, this is
it's always going to be both. It's always going to be there. Now, is it just symbolic? Like, do we just think is it only there to like represent a kind of abstract concept? And that, I'm afraid, that particular thing is a monster that lives only in high school English classes.
Right.
Like
yes.
only high school English classes can hunt the rare sea beast, which is like the literary or artistic or poetic or musical device that exists only to symbolize an abstract idea. This is this very facile and false notion of like how art works, where like in the real world, I mean, obviously there are exceptions, but like basically when something is used to represent an abstract idea, it's also talking about something in the real world. That's why it's potent and powerful as a way of talking about an abstract idea. So even, but the point is really well taken that, you know, so for instance, like in the time period that I work on, like the guy I'm working on right now, in the 9th century, he just like he wakes up in the morning and the very first thing he does is like allegorize something. He's like, oh, early in the morning, time to make an allegory. You know, he just like allegorizes everything on the planet, you know. It's just like it's just how he lives. It's the thing that he lives for. But that doesn't mean he doesn't think anything's real, you know. Right. No, and that's an important distinction, right? I was having a conversation with my poor grandmother, who will not listen to this podcast, so it's okay that I tell this That's
story.
right. Your rich grandmother will, though, so that's fine.
God rest her soul. I was having a conversation with my poor grandmother who, you know, just a real sweet, you know, kind of church lady person. And I guess I was the first person, and we'll have to do a whole episode on this, but I happened to mention to her that pelicans are used throughout liturgical and sacred art as a symbol of the Eucharist. We'll do a whole episode on why that is, but if this is not intuitive to you, put a mental note somewhere, tie your finger to something, slam that door. Wait a second, that's something else. But anyway, I bring this up to her and she was like horrified by it. She's like, she actually said, I don't like this fact. Oh, no. I wish you hadn't told me this fact, because this idea freaked her out that medieval people and really Christians before sort of the modern era saw everything in creation as symbolizing God in some capacity. He's the artist, so therefore whatever he makes is going to teach us something about him. So when you go out as a monk or a nun or whatever to create your bestiary or your encyclopedia, you're going to be looking at what's the thing's genus. You're going to be looking at what it eats. You're going to be looking at what it's, you know, mating and you know, what's it called? Migration habits are. And then you're also going to be looking at like what it has to say about Jesus just by nature of its existence. Right. And this is something that so yes, absolutely. This is something we know, what you're saying, that everything is real and everything is symbolic to the traditional Christian imagination. And it's always both. But I don't know, because mermaids represent this third category, right? Where they are, and all magical creatures do, where they are folklore, but they're not folklore that is believed in as part of the theology of the religion. They're just accepted as a part of the natural world that then the religion in question treats with the same symbolic language that it would treat everything in the natural world, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So like, well, let me give you an example. Yeah. Like, so in biblical parlance, you know, there's a lot of, there are a lot of times, like in the Psalms, especially, but other places as well, like Job, among others, where it will talk about like God making the sea creatures or God playing with the sea creatures. This is absolutely amazing song about God making the sea creatures to play with. And we talked about this in Angels 1. Yeah, exactly. And so the question is then, what are these sea creatures? And the thing is, there's just a bunch of sea creatures that are just kind of undifferentiated sea creatures. There's things like, you know, sharks and fish and whales and dragons and sea monsters of various unspecified kinds, and the Leviathan and mermaids and
flying fish and dogfish that are like literally like dogs who are fish,
Right.
etc. These are just undifferentiated sea creatures, you know, and it's not that like, I mean, it's not that people didn't have an interest in natural science or whatever. I mean, that waxes and wanes in history and in given locale, so we can't generalize about it. But it's not even like, oh, well, there's the things that we know really exist. And then there's the like, well, then there's like the borderline creatures that probably don't, but we're going to talk about as if they do. Like, we just talk about them all together. You know, I mean, like the book of Isaiah in the Septuagint, the Greek translation made in the 2nd century BC, which becomes the standard one that's what Christianity uses, etc., talks about in the wilderness, like a wilderness is marked because there's an Onocontaurus there, an Onocentaur, which is a centaur who is, instead of being half man, half horse, he's half man, half mule.
Oh, sure.
That's
one
you
does.
know, and this is not proposed in the Greek translation of the book of Isaiah as like, now we're switching into mythological language. It's just like, there it is.
Right. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say here. I just think it's like, so if I'm a missionary, I'm a monk in the 4th century, and I'm preaching Christ, and I'm trying to come in and I'm teaching you all about the things about Christianity that I want you to know. And like, this is what an angel is, and this is who the Trinity is and stuff. Right. I believe in mermaids.
Yeah.
You believe in mermaids.
Who doesn't?
Neither of us consider mermaids as part of our religion.
Yeah.
Right.
And they will become fodder for the religion.
Our particular religious lens. Yeah, they might be fodder for the. And so I just think that's important to have as a foundation for this discussion, because we're going to be talking about how mermaids are used in art to represent different things, but we have to start with the presupposition that that's not their main aim, that this is something that the artist is putting on the mermaid and saying, oh, a mermaid in my particular artwork represents this thing, but that's not what mermaids represent, because mermaids are real.
Right.
That just represents that in this. And so that's sort of the foundation I'm trying to set up for this conversation. Does that make more sense?
I think that does. And like, let me just push on that a little bit more, maybe, because we, depending on where somebody might be coming from in their own background, there is a kind of, you know, the sort of think about like the new atheist background, the sort of background noise of sort of new atheism, sort of the notion that like, science, quote unquote, is kind of the only rationality, and the faith is just all kind of a bunch of mumbo jumbo. There's this sense that I don't believe
in God. I only believe in science.
I only believe in science.
I hate all the orphans that ever lived.
Thanks, Nacho Libre.
There you go.
So, there's this sense that like, oh, well, religious people believe things that obviously don't. They believe a bunch of stupid myths like flying spaghetti monsters and like big guys in the sky who throw lightning bolts, and that like, this is
Saint Marinara, pray for us.
Saint Marinara, comma, pray for us, exclamation point. Like, that this is what it means to be a religious person, is that you believe all these like fairy tales and stuff like this is all crazy.
Yes.
And you're really helpfully pointing out that like, actually hold the phone, stop, time out, like, what we're talking about, like, as you say, this is not an article of faith. Like, nobody says like, you know, like, do you believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? I do. Do you believe in mermaids? I do. Do you believe in, you know, like, nobody's being.
Although if there's a church that does that, I would like to join your religion.
Go ahead and join. That's right. That's right. Oh my gosh, new idea. Mermaidology, mermaid Scientology.
Oh, we're gonna get into that.
Oh yeah. You're right. Yeah. So this is not an article of faith for anybody. Like, this is just a broadly held thing in the human experience, that like, mermaids are a thing. And then because the human being is a rational religious creature, he makes rational religious analysis of the things that he knows to exist. And one of those things that he knows to exist for much of history, in many places in history, is the mermaid.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so Hindus will say, oh, a mermaid in our art could be seen as representing this. And Christians will say, oh, a mermaid in our art, could be seen as doing this, that, or the other. And it often means several different things. But we have to start off with the presupposition that the people painting these things assume that mermaids are totally real and that they are then placing their own artistic meaning on top of that.
Exactly.
I just personally think that's a very necessary thing for this conversation.
Yeah.
So thank you for humoring me.
Yeah, I hadn't thought to go back to that point, but you're totally right. May I offer one point, which is like famous people who saw mermaids, colon.
Sure.
There's a lot. You could answer. You could be a long list of fun things, but probably my favorite single one is famous people who saw mermaids, colon, Christopher Columbus.
Yeah. This is one of the earliest reported like scientific things on mermaids. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Christopher Columbus.
Yeah, because he writes about like having seen a mermaid, and and again, like just dispositionally, I am so incredibly allergic to the like contemporary jump to be like, oh well, he obviously saw a walrus or a porpoise or a sea lion or whatever.
There's few things that my wife and I rant about together more often than that kind of modernist hubris where it's like, oh, they just saw a blank.
Yeah. Which is extra hilarious because of your wife's connection to SeaWorld.
Right. My wife, don't cancel me. My wife works with sea creatures at SeaWorld.
Which is amazing.
That's a little thing we're going to throw out here on the podcast.
She's technically a mermaid, actually. A mermatron, actually, because she's married.
She's going to love that.
Technically a mermatron, yes. But yeah. So like, whatever else was happening there, let's just like throw that out. Like, who saw a mermaid? Christopher Columbus saw a mermaid. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I also think what that does, that historical perspective. So actually let's go back to this museum exhibit that inspired this whole topic. They had a little section on the Kraken.
Ooh.
And they're like, now, of course, we know that Krakens aren't real.
Aww.
But something that's similar to Krakens is the giant squid.
Yay!
And I go, you absolute butt monkeys. Like, are you dumb? Like, if a medieval person sees this thing with 1,000 tentacles that's attacking small vessels, you don't get to say they were wrong just because you want to give that thing a different name.
Yeah,
like
exactly. Like
Krakens are real, y'all. Like Krakens are real. You just named it a different thing based on your understanding of its genus. And maybe your understanding is more eloquent, but that doesn't mean that they were believing in some parallel magical creature. It was this. And this stuff happens all the time. And so this hubristic idea of like, oh, they were just manatees is the specific thing they often say Christopher Columbus saw. And it's just like, what moron is looking out and going, I want to have sex with that manatee. Hey, that's what I want to do.
Gentle listener, if this is you, if you heard that question, you said, oh, that's me.
Please dial 1-800.
Yes, exactly. Save the manatees.
There is help.
There is help for you. There is help for you.
Yeah. Call our hotline.
That's right.
We're here for you 24/7.
Keep the manatees safe from you. Call our hotline.
It also ignores, and this is particularly relevant to mermaids. So what's the one thing that everybody knows about mermaids, right? They sing and they lure ships. This is kind of a universal thought, especially in European mermaid folklore, but it comes out of the Greek, it comes out of Babylon, very, very early on. Obviously everyone goes, oh, maybe this is just whale song, or maybe this is, what are they hearing? Are you aware that seals can mimic human speech and that this was just figured out in the last 50 years?
Wait a second. This whole time, seals have just been like hanging out, chatting to each other, like repeating profane sailor talk.
Well, literally profane sailor talk. In the early 1980s, there was a harbor seal, which are the same ones that my wife actually does work with often, at the Boston, I believe the Boston Aquarium. It was in Boston, Massachusetts. And his name was Hoover. And he could speak some English words. And he could speak them like a crazy, angry, swearing Boston man.
Oh my! Which is all redundant because that's the only kind of Boston man. Yeah.
And he would just scream. He would say, "Get over here! Get over here!" And you can listen to audio of this. It's incredible.
What?
And scientists were thinking it was faked or whatever. And so they recreated the experiment, and basically seals can teach themselves to mimic the speech of humans in order to steal fish from them.
Yes.
So there is,
it always comes back to stealing fish.
Right. So in Ireland, where there's all mermaid myth and Selkie myth are almost identical, right? Mermaids, half woman, half fish, although we have to actually get into that because mermaids aren't even half woman, half fish. And then Selkies, which are in Celtic folklore, these women who sort of become seals like werewolves by sort of putting on the seal skin and then taking it off, and they spend a night on the land, and then night and they're, plagued by their own grief-stricken dualism. In Ireland, there are all these harbor seals that would have been hanging out by docks and learning to imitate the speech to try to steal fish from these guys. And so that brings me back around to this hubristic modern notion of oh, they just saw this thing and people from the past are so dumb. God, it just, it grinds my gears when people do that. So
yeah,
we are going to be going into this podcast assuming that people from the past are smart and mermaids are real.
Yeah, and maybe apparently harbor seals are crafty, tricksy,
smartest creatures,
fish stealing monsters, and we should not underestimate them.
We need to not trust them. They're moving into our towns. They're wrecking our neighborhoods. They're eyeing up our women.
They are taking our jobs. They're taking our fish stealing jobs.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. No, that's right. And also that it's actually by its nature, it has to be a super varied phenomenon, whatever it is that people are seeing when they're seeing mermaids, it's got to be a lot of different things. It happens at a lot of different times and places. And so okay. All right. I don't know what it is, but that's a good account for one stream that could be feeding into the mermaid well.
Except that when they're seeing, and I'm not going to make this whole podcast about trying to convince myself that mermaids are actually real, because that would be insane. I want to talk about art, but I do think people from the past aren't idiots, right? When they're saying, oh, look at this mermaid, she's got a sea dog on a leash, and then they're painting an otter. If I'm just seeing an otter for the first time, it's a puppy with a long kind of fishish tail that swims in the water. That is absolutely legitimate to make the deduction, even on a scientific level, because it's a mammal and it's, in the weasel family, and weasels, related to canines by extension and all this sort of thing. I mean, even on that level, it makes sense to intuit that. So if you're just a sailor who's seeing a mermaid, you're not going to see a manatee and go, that looks like a human woman.
Look at that sexy lady. I like the way that she's
just
yelling
not going to do that. So either you're lying or you saw something, but you're not seeing a manatee. That whole argument makes me so mad.
Right. That's a good point. I feel like we have to steer clear of otters, because if I get talking about otters, which is God's favorite creature, I'm not going to get off of it. So,
okay.
Yeah.
We won't bring up otters.
We're not going to bring up otters again until we talk about otters.
We otters stick away from that.
Stick away from that. That's my whole point. That's exactly right.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Okay. That said, we should get into what mermaids do actually then tend to represent throughout Christian art.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So
now that we've established this.
And you mentioned this already, so I just want to bring it out, sort of clear it into the open. So one thing in the set of strands that you'll see in European history, whether it's visual art or literary art, is the interchangeability between, it's a very mixed interaction between the notion of a siren and then the notion of a mermaid. So, anybody in Western culture basically can have some kind of connection with a siren from the Odyssey, right? There's three beautiful women who hang out on a rock and sing a song that is literally irresistible to men, and so it lures them. They have to come closer because they have to come to make sweet love to the maker of this beautiful music, and then they crash upon rocks, and then the sirens eat them or something.
Sure, as one does.
One does. Kind of classic. How you get your food when you live in the ocean situation.
Don't hate the player. Hate the game.
Hate the game, man. I didn't invent the ocean. Okay. So that will mix really interestingly into this. So sometimes, like in visual art, they'll be represented like a siren will be represented like more like a harpy, if you think like a harpy. So like a woman's face and maybe some of a woman's torso, breasts often, but then really a bird body. So kind of like a scary monster that like if you saw it, you would immediately be like, oh, gross, you know.
Scary monster. And with the like the positioning in the ocean as the context, definitely they're making a comparison to like a seagull woman or an albatross woman.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Screaming on the rocks.
Right. Yeah. Good. So you're right. So yeah, the analogy is more bird than fish. Yeah. A she-bird rather than a she-fish. And then that will get mixed, you know? And so, I mean, already you said like, obviously obviously everybody knows that mermaids sing. Well, the only reason, at least in a major strand of European culture, that everybody knows that mermaids sing is because like that kind of bleeds into them from the siren. That like, because they're also kind of sirens, and they sometimes do siren stuff. So sometimes they lure men by singing with they have their fishy tails, and then they will sing these beautiful songs, more beautiful than a human song, and then lure men into death, but not always, you know. So anyway, just to say that like if you are listening and you know your Odyssey quite well, and you were saying these fools are talking about sirens, not mermaids, the answer is like yes. We are talking about both mermaids and sirens, and that's kind of how it is. Yeah.
I will say that sirens, I mean, pretty much whenever they're depicted in Christian art are because of the kind of Odyssey and stuff. There's not a good or empathetic or, you know, pleasant depiction of them, right? These are always used when they're used, as far as what I've seen, to symbolize something sinister or something evil.
Yeah.
But mermaids have a really surprising array of things that they can represent. So, I mean, right off the bat, you're starting us off with this idea that to some degree, mermaids are just there to illustrate the creativity of God. And, you know, insofar as all of these crazy ocean creatures do. But I want to get into, so with the Nuremberg Bible thing, you mentioned that, they would be happy because this is just more territory for them. This is actually a very interesting thing. So starting with our presupposition that everybody's just assuming mermaids are real and then bringing their own theological or cultural understanding to why they might be real. There is one of the more prolific traditions within Christian art that says mermaids are the people who got left behind off the ark.
Stop it. What?
And that either sheer force of their own will via magic changes them to mermaids.
We've all done that.
Or the mercy of God
changes them into mermaids.
Not wanting them to die changes them to mermaids.
Oh my gosh, I love this so much.
When I got into this, and what's okay, but here's what's really fascinating. This is not exclusive to Christianity. It turns out that the earliest depictions of mermaids in every culture have to do with the flood myth.
Huh.
So I found this author talking about how in certain Hindu traditions, Vishnu takes on the form of a merman so that he might both tell the sort of Hindu equivalent of Noah about the coming flood, and so that he can protect sacred books that would otherwise be lost in the deluge. And then there's a parallel folklore in Ireland where Finn or Fenian also turns into what they say a half salmon man and rescues all these
half delicious,
half delicious in a different way. And he then lives as one protecting these sacred truths that he uncovered while as a merman that would have otherwise gotten destroyed by the Great Flood, and then lives there. And then when Christianity comes into Ireland, they just say, and then he got converted by St. Patrick and stopped being a mermaid.
Stopped being anymore. A merman.
Right. but you see this a lot. So mermaids is really interesting. And Aztec folklore has some of this, Babylonian folklore has some of this, where they're looking at mermaids and they're going, why mermaid? Do they have the bottom half of a sea creature? Probably because of that giant flood that we all somehow inexplicably have a cultural memory of in all of our respective religious traditions.
And I just wouldn't worry about it. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now that is a marvelous idea. But it makes sense insofar as like often associated with mermaids is this notion of a fairyland, because fairyland too always exists somewhere, like you don't have, even in the contemporary imaginary, fairyland still exists somewhere. It's just that we have this we don't find the notion that there could be like an Eden or a fairy and a place where fairy kings and queens live like on the physical earth. We don't find that credible. So we use different spatial imagery like dimensions, right? So like, why are all of Neil Gaiman, like Neil Gaiman has this, my favorite book of his, Neverwhere. He just locates fairyland in another dimension. And that's sort of the peanut butter we need to swallow that. Yeah, because we wouldn't. It's funny, like a contemporary imaginary can't accept the idea that like I could go to somewhere in South America and that there would be like fairyland, but like I can accept it if it's another dimension, for all of this. If we don't have like different dimensionary language, and if the earth hasn't been explored, then there's lots of places that it could be, and so like, where can you locate fairy? One place you can do it is under the sea. Under the sea. It had to happen sometime.
Yeah, exactly. It's weird that it took this long.
I'm actually surprised. Yeah. That was a really.
It's weird that you were the first one to bring it up, not the Disney adult on the other end of the camera.
Yeah, you're welcome. And so because of that, like anytime you have a fairyland, there's going to be a mixture of like, it's a different kind of power. And because it's a different kind of power, it has with it like also a different kind of knowledge, and it can have menace as well. So it have both promise and menace.
I will also say that is a modernist luxury to not be scared when you say the word fairyland, because fairyland's a scary place you want to go. Like it's a bad neck of the woods, right? And these are creatures that the best they can do for you is not care.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Because even if they like you and they care,
it might be bad.
They're going to start giving you gift. There's a wonderful, oh God, she's wonderful. She's this girl on TikTok who got a master's degree in folklore.
Yeah.
And now like can't work anywhere. And so she just does a TikTok on a very serious TikTok series on how to avoid monsters, where she talks about them as totally real. And she's like, if you encounter a vampire, if you encounter a fairy, don't give it your name. Never say thank you to a fairy, because that implies they've done you a favor that you need to do something back for them for. And that traps you in a legal contract with them that they could murder you over or trap you for 1,000 years in fairyland. So she teaches like all the politics of how to interact with creatures when you encounter them. I love it so much.
Oh my gosh. So much. That's amazing.
But that's the kind of attitude that we're talking about when we talk about fairylands. And that's why the ocean is one of these places, because they're always places that do not sustain human life, right? Another big fairyland is Lapland. Lapland is considered fairyland for a lot of early European cultures, which is why we say Santa Claus lives in the North Pole, right? That's how that ends up happening, is that Lapland is this terrible frozen tundra place. That must be where the fairies are. And so Santa, when he sort of gets amalgamated into the fairyland, he's the king of the fairies, and he chimneys even, right? Chimneys are a doorway to spirits and fairies. That's why we have to seal them up with the flue. But we open it up for St. Nicholas to come down. So he's the one good spirit from fairyland, and he must live in the frozen north with the other fairies. So these inhospitable places, the ocean, the tundra, the top of the mountain, become the places where the fairies must be and the mermaids must be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then that makes sense that that could be connected with this antediluvian knowledge, that there's some sort of, it's not just that it's a different kind of power, like it comes from a different source, or a different kind of knowledge, like it comes from a different, again, dimension, to think in contemporary terms, but that it's more paradisical knowledge, which again we see like this is the whole, like this is a lot of the power of like the myth of Atlantis, even in the modern and contemporary world, is that like somehow this kind of antediluvian world has something perfect and beautiful, even like the Black Panther, the movie, captures something with the imagination of Wakanda. There they do actually a really cool idea of creating a kind of fairyland. Again, it's Marvel, so it's sort of half fairyland, half just technology, which is stupid, but they managed to actually create a physical where on the earth that has fairy elements, that is not just a dimensional trick. And that's pretty cool, because that's pretty rare in the contemporary moment.
Much more fun than what they do with Thor, where it is in
it's just another dimension. It's like, well, all right, that's fine. Yeah. Hey, listen, I didn't expect to be talking so much about fairy, but I do love it completely. I want to bring up a little bit about one fun place where you can find mermaids.
Please. No, this conversation is going to be a free for all. So
one fun place where you can find mermaids is, if you were watching on YouTube, this gigantic book, Spencer's The Fairy Queen. It's
truly huge.
It's really big. When I bought it, I didn't realize it was quite so long. I confess.
Spencer's The Fairy Queen, you said, is what it's called? Yeah.
So The Fairy Queen is one of the great books of English literature from all time. I think quite at the present moment, it's not sort of as well known as it's been in the past, but
written famously by Princess Diana Spencer.
Exactly right, Princess Diana Spencer. Yes, sadly, taken from us too soon. Candle in the Wind, etc. And if she'd been on a boat, then the sea people would have saved her, but it didn't happen.
Right. We could have. Yeah, she would have jumped in the water. She would have become a mermaid. We could have Princess Di, the mermaid.
Exactly. That's right.
This is all really our faults collectively.
Exactly. So it was written at the end of the 16th century by Edmund Spenser. And it's this really rich, it's sort of like the great allegorical epic poem of the English language. It's really big. Not gonna lie, and I felt like a liar and a fraud, because although I spent my whole life with literature, I'd never actually read it, so I've been reading it very slowly, and it's really marvelous. But so the whole thing is it's this big allegorical epic poem about like the virtues and the vices, the triumph of Protestantism in England, which Spencer's all about. This is good, triumph of Protestantism in England, etc. So it's got all kinds of wild things. But here there happened to be a couple of. There's a whole marvelous section about our topic today. So I'm going to read you just two stanzas from Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen that go like this. So our hero at this point is the figure of Temperance, whose name is Guyon, but he's temperance basically. So, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, please read it. Please read it in a very Shakespearean accent, if you would.
I wish I could. I'm just gonna I'm gonna try to read it as best I can, because it's in late 16th century English, and everything's in iambic pentameter, of course, as it should be. But sometimes he really plays fast and loose with the iam sometimes. So here's how it goes. And now they nigh approached to the stead, whereas those mermaids dwelt. It was a still and calmy bay, on th'un side sheltered with the broad shadow of an hoary hill, on t'other side an high rock towered still, that twixt them both a pleasant port they made, and did like an amphitheatre fulfill. There those 5 sisters had continual trade, and used to bed themselves in that deceitful shade. They were fair ladies till they fondly strived with the Laconan maids for mastery, of whom they overcomen were deprived of their proud beauty, and the one moiety transformed to fish for their bold circuitry. But the upper half their hue retained still, and their sweet skill in wonted melody. which ever after they abused to ill, to lure weak travelers, whom gotten they did kill. Okay, so that's a little taste of what
a little too long for a back tattoo, but it has the spirit of the kind of back tattoo I would like to have.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, maybe like just take your favorite lines, and make that. Or
Right.
get a bigger back, one or the other. These are all open. You could gain 100 pounds for the sake of this tattoo. It's really not hard. So there's a lot that's going on there. Mermaids sort of show up suddenly, and they have a lot of the characteristics of sirens, like from the Odyssey. There are some of the elements of the way that the scene is described are taken from the Aeneid, where there are not mermaids, but it's connected there in the context with people heading into dangerous lust territories. And but there's 5 mermaids here rather than 3, which is a trip, because the sirens, they come in 3s. And here there's 5 mermaids. So you're like, OMG, why are there 5 mermaids? Well, there's 5 mermaids because there's 5 senses, buddy. So the mermaids here are automatically 5 senses, right? And what do they do? So there's some of the mythological background that they were women, and then they fight with these other powerful creatures, and they lose, and then they get transformed into so they're half fish at the bottom half fish. At the one moitié or moiety, I think we pronounce it in English, moiety, one half. So the bottom half is a fish. The top half is still a beautiful maiden. But there is this interest. So what do they do? Well, they sing beautifully, so they're definitely sirens, and that they lure men into their death, and they kill them. So the 5 senses become this. They become these ways in which the person is lured to his death, right? Can be lured to his death. And there is something here where it says that their upper half, their hue retained still. And there's an association here that so they maintain their feminine beauty. And part of what's going on here is this association that for a contemporary thinker might be a little bit confusing. Like if I say who in the human race is crazed for sex and just thinking about how to get it all the time and how to make another person give this person what this person wants, and that's just what that person lives for, and all of this, we think like a frat boy. Right. I think ugh, comma, men, exclamation
men only
point.
Want one thing, and it's disgusting. It's
disgusting. Yeah, exactly. For a long period in Western European history, it's not universal, and it's not every time, and it's not every place, but there is a big chunk of time where that is women. Everyone is certain that women are sex crazed, wild, irrational, that they're the ones who can't stop, they can't control their passions, that men are kind of more rational, that they can control their passions, and that they wouldn't be doing it all the time.
Rational, but men are, well, different cultures. Now we're getting into one of my favorite things, which is just how sort of gender construct changes throughout history. And I don't mean in sort of a, LGBTQ plus spectrum way. I mean, just strictly in terms of the stereotypes we apply, because they're areas, they're lots of different time periods covered in the Bible. Obviously, they're not just all one time period, and there are huge swaths like when we're talking about the story of Joseph, for instance, of Technicolor Dreamcoat fame, where women are, sort of stereotypically the sex predators in the way that men are considered now, and men are considered the emotional, lovey-dovey, cuddly ones, right? So men think with their feelings, and they're very close, and they hold hands, and they're friends, and they cuddle, and then women are sort of they're cutthroat, and they hate each other, and they compete, and then they just want to have sex with you even if they have to force themselves on you. And then that switches later on as we get closer to like King David in the Bible. And then it reoccurs throughout the, Middle Ages. And we kind of go back and forth with this. And I think that's just always a really interesting thing, especially because I will talk, now we're getting into my purview, right? But I will talk to different clients where men will try to excuse some of their behavior and say, well, this is just who men are. I'm like, well, historically, actually, that's a myth. Like, you're actually making up that men are more sexual than women are, just the way they all used to about women, and it goes back and forth. But I did want to pause at that just because I think sometimes people assume that only occurs in medieval Christianity, where women are seen as these sort of randy predators because Christianity is like this sexist religion or whatever. And it's just universally not true, right? That the different cultures will just choose who's the sexual predator right now and who's the emotional innocent one right now. And sometimes it's women and sometimes it's men. And this sort of goes back and forth. But you are correct that at the time that a lot of this mermaid art is coming out, it happened to be women's turn at the butcher counter, and they were the ones sort of being seen this way.
Yeah.
Or not women generally, but definitely like the frat boy equivalent of women, whatever that would be.
Yeah.
Young wayfish, ne'er do well. They never do well.
They never.
How often do they do well?
Ne'er do wells. Ne'er. Yeah, when they thought about it, they thought about it and they did it ne'er. Yeah. Right, and it's because this is and then this does become a big thing that, like, when this is particularly with mermaids, when we're thinking about, again, these are just broad presences in the cultural imagination. Like, I say men, and you think only after one thing, and then but now maybe it's, say, like the end of the 16th century with this fairy queen, and you think like women, you think only after one thing, and that is part of what's playing around here, is that so like the fact that the five senses here are presented as lures for the human heart, that can break temperance and kill and just kill the person. So far, so that's one way of kind of describing and thinking about the nature of temperance. Okay, I get it. And then particularly associating that with women. Okay, now we're getting this particularly strong cultural association that, like, women are the more irrational ones, that women are more associated with the body, that women are they're always after one thing. And then that gets combined with the kind of like half rational, half irrational creature of a mermaid. And now like the fairyland where they come from is actually kind of more like the waste of human desire, like the whole wild yawning maw of human desire, and or hell, right?
Right. What's the I want to get it right, the Yeats poem on fairyland really sums that up really well.
Oh yeah, well, you look that up, but
come away, you fairy child, to the kingdom, fierce and wild, for the world's more full of weeping than you could understand. Like that whole thing of just like, yeah, come over to fairyland. They're all these sort of temporal desires that are fulfilled here, but then they will be ultimately empty. And this is the fear of fairyland, right? If you go to fairyland and then you take a bite of their food. I mean, the girl on TikTok talks about this all the time. You take a bite of their delicious food.
Don't do that.
All other food will taste like ash to you forever. It's essentially heroin, right? So there is always this idea, and you're getting us into something that's really important about mermaids. So the first thing they represent in Christian art, just the creativity of God. Second thing they could represent, both in Christian art and all art, is antediluvian knowledge, and this idea of like a pre-flood culture and trying to make some sense of that. But then you're getting us into this third thing, which is maybe the most prolific thing, and that's dualism, right? That there's something attractive about this desire, and then literally, in the case of mermaids, literally below the surface, there is something sinister waiting to snap you up, whether that is drugs in the analogous sense, the food of fairyland, or real drugs, or whether that is the spiritual drugs of sin, or whether it is sort of what they're going to be talking about, like sexually transmitted diseases literally below the sort of surface or the waist of this creature who's luring you. This whole idea of, yes, it appears there's something beautiful here, but below the surface is this fishy tail that denotes something much more sinister that you should be wary to avoid.
Yeah. And here, when you say dualism, now just because of my own like the theological and philosophical training, like I hear dualism and I automatically think like, oh, like opposition of the mind, I think that the soul to the body, or like Manichaean dualism, that there's like an absolute evil power and an absolute good power, and they're locked forever in eternal combat. But you mean this like duality, that things that there's this duality that it's vexed because it's doubled, that the doubling is both what's attractive about it and what's horrible about it. And in fact, I found this really lovely source that now is looking specifically in a different way from Spencer, allegorically at the creature of the mermaid. So like, again, we all know mermaids are real. Cool. What do we do with it? So there is this German guy, Konrad of Mecklenburg, in the late 4th century. He spends a little bit of time allegorizing. So he quotes a 2nd century Greek natural history text that talks about mermaids, and then he's like, okay, so then what is a mermaid? You know, like how do we understand it? And this caught me off guard when I was reading it, which is, he says they're images of hypocrites, the hypocrite, because when they're with other people, they seem just like human beings. But then when you get them off on their own, you see their other half, and they're like beasts who don't abide by the law of God, and who are in fact nothing like what they seem. That like, so then the mermaid,
and you sort of realize with horror. Yeah.
So the mermaid is this like model of the hypocrite. And then he also associates them with like evil powers and also heretics, right? So like, because they're doubled where they should be single. And it's rather than the single-heartedness for God, they're doubled. And that's their corruption and their evil. And it's funny, when I first saw that, like this, I was like, Connie, bro, where are you coming from with this? That seems kind of wild, but you're getting us exactly to that point, which is that like, it's that we want the person to be one, and when I discover that he or she is two, in a way that seems unnatural, like it's a shock and it's a brutal and a horrible thing. And so there is this, like, the dark side of the mermaid, is not just like, oh, Ariel, whatever, I want to like splash around and like play with forks and things. But like, oh, this should be one species, one creature, and it's two and jammed into one so it's half of each without really being either. And so it's somehow really broken and corrupt.
And there's a betrayal there if you trust one over the other.
Yeah. Right. So that's interesting, because that, if I could put it, one last point on that, is that, in the Fairy Queen, Spencer's The Fairy Queen, this is, in contemporary language, we would say this is a very gendered vision of morality, right? Like, it is not a coincidence that it's mermaids being presented, that they're women. It's using particular characteristics about how women are thought about, in the like late 16th century cultural imaginary in England. And he's using it for significant literary, theological, and philosophical effect. This one, Konrad of Mecklenburg, is not presenting a specifically gendered vision, actually, which is very interesting. Like, again, you just think like, oh, those Middle Ages, they hate women. But no, it's not. Here, this is not. He's saying like, no, what's wrong with this is the doubling. What's wrong with it is the doubling. In fact, he says the same thing about, in the same breath, he's talking about centaurs as well. And that what's wrong with centaurs is that centaurs too are an image of hypocrites because of the doubling.
But mermaids would have been seen as even more so, more folk. And I'm about to establish that because, because there's literally a woman above the surface and then this other monstrous thing below the surface,
right?
Where a centaur is not veiled. So centaurs in classical mythology do represent a duality, but they more represent the duality of wildness and civilizedness within each and every one of us, right? Satyrs or fauns represent this as well. And this is very much why both are used so much in C.S. Lewis's work, right? Because he's drawing on this idea of wildness. And I mean, even with the character of Aslan, is he a tame lion? No, he's quite wild and ferocious, right? So there's this sort of dichotomy happening.
I love how the beaver is suddenly Johnny Depp from Pirates of the Caribbean. No, he's wild and ferocious. Delicious.
He's wild and ferocious, mate. He should absolutely be hashtag free Johnny. Johnny Depp aside, the reason that I emphasize the merfolk thing is because mermaids is really kind of a misnomer, especially in this period that you're talking about, towards the end of the 16th century. And frankly, earlier, you see a lot of mer priests.
Stop it. No, you do not. Stop it.
I do not accept. And I'm I'll pull this up on the YouTube video, but I'm going to share this with you. Let me see if I can share my screen really quickly on the old Zoom here. All right. Do you see this?
Oh my gosh.
See what I'm seeing?
Okay, listen. I did not want to believe, but in fact, here is a merman dressed as a monk holding a fish.
Holding a fish in consecration.
Yeah, I was not ready for that. Okay.
So this is my favorite image of this motif. This is not the only image in this motif. In fact, there are hundreds, and they're in mostly drawn art, but there are some sculptures too. And especially as the Reformation takes off in the Netherlands, you see a large focus on the creature of the sea monk, which is this creature that ostensibly is believed to exist. It's described as being about 8 feet long. It washes up on a beach in the Netherlands at some point, has a fully tonsured head, and just screams for 3 days before finally dying.
Okay,
no one can figure out what this actually was.
3 days, and I did not die.
No one can figure out what this actually was, but this is a big motif, and what these represent this thing that we're talking about too. That there are clergy who are looking to lure you and trick you.
Fascinating!
But beneath their robes is this cold, monstrous fish.
Oh my God.
And this is my favorite image of this because he's raising a fish in consecration as a false Eucharist.
Whoa.
He is offering you the flesh of the fish so that you too might become this monster.
Whoa,
and so
that's
lest we think for a moment that mermaids are just this sort of sexist motif, which, as we've already established, is, they could only be in this very relegated third column of the duality thing that we're talking about, not in the creativity of God or the antediluvian knowledge part. But lest we think even in this area that this is exclusively relegated to women, it is not. Mer priests, mer monks, sea bishops, who have like squids for hats, everywhere.
Oh my
because of this sinister, don't let false clergy lead you on lest you get drowned.
Oh, that is so fascinating. So I had no idea. Again, when I first read this thing from Conrad of Megenberg, I thought, oh, this is just like his being kind of, this is just a very particular take on mermaids I never would have thought of. But apparently this is actually I'm the dumb one. This is a very broad spread sort of idea. Mm. And that's so fascinating. So for instance, there's one of my very favorite saints of all time, one of my very favorite women of all time, is Catherine of Siena, this unbelievably boss chica from the 14th century, who's a Dominican and all this kind of stuff. And she wrote this, some contemporary Catholics get very upset and angry about some things that are the directions the church seems to be taking, and corruption of the clergy, and ignorance of the clergy, and also ignorance of lay people, et cetera, and can be very irate about that, and I understand completely.
Yeah, rightfully so. Yeah.
But if you ever thought wow, I want like a real, like why can't people just be real and say how things really are in the church? Like, go to your local Catholic bookstore and pick up a copy of Catherine of Siena's book, The Dialogue. It is like 400 of the greatest pages you ever read in your entire life. It is incredibly hard. It will destroy you. I mean, I say this because it destroyed me, and I've read it a bunch of times. But she has like 100-page section in the middle where she's all this beautiful praise of like the church, and like God the Father is speaking to her, and it's not exactly a mystical vision, but that's how she's writing it, is that God the Father is speaking to her. And this incredibly rich theology about like everything, the church and how to be a saint. And like, it's just absolutely amazing. Like the richest stuff you'll ever read. And then there's like 100 pages in the middle. It's like, all right, like I'm gonna break it down for you. And God the Father's like, let me explain to you what's really happening in the church. And then he like goes on and explains for like 100 pages, just this incredibly wild description of like, very believably 14th century clerical corruption and all these kinds of things. And one of them is he talks, Catherine talks about like priests who are like living sinful lives, like they have, you know, concubines and families and stuff who like are at church with them, and everyone's embarrassed, and they know that they're in mortal sins. They know they can't receive communion, but they have to say mass. And so apparently this was a thing, is that at the time priests would priests knew
these specific priests.
So these specific priests, like this is the way that a kind of priestly corruption could go at the time, is that they knew that they couldn't receive communion because that would be an even worse mortal sin, and that would send them directly to hell. Do not pass go. But they weren't going to stop doing the things that they were doing.
Right.
And if for a priest, if you celebrate mass, you have to receive communion. Like that's not like there's no way the priest can not. So apparently one thing that was happening at the time for the people in this situation is that they squared the circle for themselves mentally and liturgically by just not saying the words of consecration.
Oh my God.
And the mass at the time would have been said quietly for the most part. And so you wouldn't have necessarily been able to hear with your own ears whether the priest had said the words of consecration or not. So that way it wasn't really the Eucharist and he could receive it. And like the mass was a fraud, you know, and if he distributed communion, everything was a fraud. But like it wasn't really communion because he could receive it. That was fine. So Catherine has this incredible prayer that like she puts on the mouth of God the Father to like,
this is in the dialogue.
This is in the dialogue still. Yeah. To pray before receiving communion. And it's like, she says like, you should look as a faithful Christian, like you should look at the host before you receive it. And you should say something like, I believe that if the priest has done his job correctly, you are truly the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, the one who was born of the Virgin Mary, the body that suffered on the cross, and that was buried in the tomb, that rose from the dead on the third day, etc. But there's this fascinating caveat, right? Like if the priest has done his job correctly,
right? If the priest is not a merman secretly consecrating a fish.
Exactly. So it's not even just that like this is a kind of Protestant polemic, although it makes perfect sense that would become a visual trope in some of those polemics. But that this is also like a real anxiety for Christians, period, is just like what we don't know, we don't know. And like everything rides on this. And so, but like, oh my gosh, there are these corrupt clergy who, in the gospel, like Christ says, who among you would give your son a stone when he asks for a loaf of bread, or a scorpion if he asks for an egg? But this is exactly it. It's like, oh my gosh, like what if this corrupt priest whose like life I know isn't super corrupt and all this kind of stuff, what if he's actually giving me a fish? What if he is actually a mermonk and he's not a real monk and he is actually like a monster trying to drag me into the deep? Yeah,
below the robes are this thing that wants to drown me. You mentioned, and I would be remiss if I did not rewind just briefly, you mentioned going out and supporting your local Catholic bookstore by picking up the dialogue there. And it sort of red flagged me that I had failed to mention our generous sponsor. Our sponsor is plural, Catholic Creatives, and also Catholic.store. Catholic Creatives, for its part, we're talking a lot about the Renaissance here, and it's an organization dedicated to igniting what it calls a new Renaissance through prayer and beauty and the creative spirit. And specifically, what they're doing is they're trying to connect and support and promote different artists and innovators and makers and storytellers from kind of across the faith tradition. But it does take a community to bring big ideas like this to life. So I would encourage you to go on over to Catholic Creatives /support and find out about our Patreon, the Patreon for this podcast and for Catholic Creatives. By doing so, you're not only going to help out this specific podcast, you're also going to contribute directly to future workshops and summits and resources meant to support Catholic artists around the country. And you'll also get an inside track on these activities by getting access to our member-only Facebook group. So again, do check that out at catholiccreatives.org /support. And then in addition to that, again, on the whole, picking up the dialogue at your local Catholic bookstore, there are a lot of amazing Catholic artisans out there and authors and painters and sculptors doing some really cool shit that you're not going to find on Amazon or whatever, giant evil conglomerate you normally shop from. So I would strongly encourage you guys also to go check out amazing, beautiful products by independent artisans like that at Catholic.store, which again does go directly to supporting this podcast and other Catholic artists. So become a part of the movement. Check out Catholic.store and CatholicCreatives.org /support today.
Yeah, and let me write on that for just one quick second, which is to say that if you are a faithful Creative Things listener, or if this is your first time and you think to yourself like, wow, once a week is not enough for me to just jump into this weird bromance situation talking about art and creative things, listen. We have all kinds of ideas for secret.
Oh God, are you going to tell people about this?
I'm spilling the beans. We have all kinds of ideas for secret Gnostic Creative Things episodes that are too hot for Creative Things that we will release.
Way too hot.
Way too hot
for a public podcast.
So we will release them. But to subscribers, but we have to have enough Patreon subscribers to make a sub Gnostic release of too hot for Creative Things episodes worth our while. So if you are thinking like I am that mer person who needs more of this, then by all means tell all of your mer friends to sign up.
Yeah. Definitely tell all your merfolk. Okay, so I want to deviate just from the very interesting subject we're on right now of duality in mermaids, because we keep saying this phrase that is really bothering me called, we're saying half fish. We keep saying mermaids are half fish. And I know everybody listening is going to go, well, yeah, you're saying that because mermaids are half fish. But I want to make the point that mermaids are not actually half fish. They are only half fish in the sense that medieval people and ancient people thought anything that lived in the water was a fish.
Well, right? Yes, technically speaking, anything that lives in the water is a fish. Don't you dare say otherwise. I have read Moby Dick, and I know that at the end of 50 pages of debating about whether or not the whale is a mammal or not, he comes down on the true side, which is that because the whale lives in the water, it's a fish.
Sure. And in that sense, okay, if you're going to go from Herman Melville-esque science, by all means, merfolk are fish. But I do just want to throw in, because every couple of years, there's some wise ass who gets on, BuzzFeed or whatever the, digital Pravda is at that point, and argues that, because you already mentioned Little Mermaid, right? Oh, Ariel's gonna, have sex with Prince Eric, and then they're gonna lay a bunch of eggs, and it's gonna be disgusting, and blah, blah, blah. So just to foil those people, because I hate cynics like that, mermaids are technically half dolphin. Ah. And the reason that we know this is because their tails are horizontal. Oh, so if you look at a mermaid, right, they're always kind of facing you, and then their fin is splayed out horizontally in the same direction that our arms are on either side of our bodies. But fish tails are very pointedly vertical, and this is kind of how you tell the difference from a silhouette between a shark and a whale or a dolphin
And a mermaid.
Right? So
yeah, right. Shark
and
is
it
shark or mermaid?
So,
question mark. This is your life could depend on this question.
Right, shark or mermaid, which is more likely to eat you. But yes, I just throw that in because since we are, for the purpose of this episode, assuming that merfolk are real, by all accounts, scientific and other and folkloric and otherwise, any drawing of merfolk show them as mammals. So we should start off with that.
Sneaky. That's a sneaky point. Some will have them have multiple tails. So like
that's true. So there's a Nordic tradition,
more like fish, but
kind of a Viking tradition. But the multiple tails, they'll have two tails, each representing a leg with sort of a vagina in the middle. And that's
how women work. Yeah.
Right, that's how women work, and this is how Starbucks works. Also,
great
the
fact.
logo
Yeah.
for Starbucks,
yeah, straight up,
is a Viking mermaid with two tails that she's sort of holding, and they've cropped it so it looks like she's holding coffee bags, but she's not. She's spreading her tails. And the
show you
something was that,
it's not coffee,
right? Well, the inspiration for this was that they wanted their coffee to be as seductive and alluring as a mermaid calling you unto your death. That was actually the real inspiration for this, that the graphic designer, I read a whole article on it, which says a lot about Starbucks as a company and just sort of the devil's bargain we've all made by getting addicted to pumpkin spice mochas.
That's incredible. You know, it's funny because I always thought that's actually really, I'm really glad to hear that because A, it's amazing and creepy and marvelous at the same time. And B, I had worked out a secret private etymology for or background for the Starbucks logo because, and just the name Starbucks period. Although the name, who knows, maybe. Anyway, in Moby Dick, there's this scene where, so one of the characters is named Starbuck, of course, and there is a scene where they're getting from a bigger boat to a little boat, and he says, someone yells out like, "Mr. Starbuck, bring the coffee."
Yes, you didn't make this up. That is actually explicitly why Starbucks is named Starbucks.
Is that really true? Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
When I first read that, I was like, I bet you this is where Starbucks got its name from because he's directly associated with coffee.
The brand became so proliferated that now Starbucks has this sort of really cool, I mean, I like it, where they try to base the architecture and the interior design of their space on like the region. So they will change the sort of aesthetics and everything. I went to like a Starbucks in Aruba that used all kind of turquoise tile and it was very pretty. And then you go to one in, Victorian Canada and but the original brand before it was sort of delineated through all these different cultural lenses was super nautical themed. And it did come explicitly from that line. And then,
oh, that's awesome. That's great.
In Moby Dick. And then the graphic designer was like, how do I connect the nautical with coffee and everything else? And this idea of coffee being a siren luring you to your death came up.
Man,
and they went with it.
I love everything about that. They're like, yeah, I want our coffee to be good. How good? So good. It's like our coffee is sitting on a rock in the ocean. And you're like, I shouldn't go get that because if I do, my ship is going to be destroyed and we're all going to die. And you do it anyway.
Yeah. And you do it anyway. Before you drop your kids off at soccer practice and you get it anyway. Back though, Starbucks and mermaid tail inversions and, mammalian physics aside, I want to continue down this path into my absolute favorite mermaid depiction in all of Catholic art. The image that actually I most wanted to talk about today. And that is an image of Saint Liban. I believe I'm pronouncing the Gaelic right. Liban.
How do you spell it?
L with an I over the thingy, or like a thingy over the I, excuse me. And then BAN. So okay. Liban, I believe is how we're doing this.
Okay.
This is a combination of two of the archetypes we're talking about. So again, archetype 1, creativity of God. Archetype 2, antediluvian knowledge. Archetype 3, duality of the human spirit and the sort of sinisterness of hypocrisy. So in Irish, mermaids are all over Irish folklore. All over Irish folklore, and they do get amalgamated with Selkies as well, in the same way that in Greco-Roman folklore, mermaids and harpies, or mermaids and sirens get amalgamated a lot. But mermaids are this really, really interesting thing in Irish folklore where Ireland specifically sees mermaids as kind of a symbol of women who have drowned.
Oh, okay. Oh no, that would be interestingly. I mean, that's a familiar enough logic from what you were saying with surviving the flood. It's not necessarily per se that they survived the flood. It's that they drowned and they turned into mermaids. Okay. Right.
Exactly. And a lot when you find when you start to look at Irish folklore, and this is maybe the saddest moment of the episode, but when you get into a lot of Irish folklore, a lot of it was trying to explain women's mental health issues. Especially when you get into like the idea of changelings, and my wife was happy and now suddenly she's had this baby and now she's tormented like a demon, which now we would identify as being postpartum depression and the mania that can come from that. They're saying maybe my wife / the baby was replaced by a fae, by a fairy. Right. And this is a thing, but there are a lot of women who, at least in the folk tradition, drowned themselves at this point. And out of sort of the mercy of God, they don't die. They get turned into mermaids. And one of the most chief myths here is of Saint Liban, which seems to at least the basis of the myth seems to predate maybe even St. Patrick. She appears canonized as St. Myrgin in the genealogies of Irish saints. She has an actual formal feast day, the 27th of January. And somewhere around, later ends up getting credited, I guess, to somewhere around 550, 558-ish. And she is living in this home. Some say she's like a wealthy person. Some say she's a peasant. Doesn't matter. Either way, this huge spring opens up under her house and forms Loch Enoch. And she, her whole family drowns. But she and her little dog, here come the Otters thing again. She and her little dog get stuck under a rock, and by either the magic of the fairies or God's mercy, she does not die. Her dog does not die. The dog gets transformed into an otter. She gets transformed into a mermaid. And she then proceeds to live for 300 years as a mermaid.
Okay, which is cool. I mean, that's I feel like that's
right.
That's the thing that
mermaids can't die, but are immortal in Irish folklore, as are all fae. Right. But then Saint Comgall comes along, and he is venturing from Ireland over to Rome, and she's singing to lure boats.
Yes, because she's a mermaid, and it's what they do.
He hears it.
Yes.
But because of his holiness, isn't tempted to have sex with her.
He just wants her coffee.
He just wants to talk to her about Jesus.
Yes.
So he takes the boat over. He talks to her about Jesus. She's moved. He baptizes her in the ocean.
Yes.
And gives her Eucharist.
Oh my gosh.
Which creates this beautiful image of this monk administering the Eucharist to a beautifully rendered mermaid.
Oh my gosh. Stunning. This is incredible.
It's so great. And then consensually, she knows this is going to happen. He tells her this is going to happen. If she receives the Eucharist, what happens? She becomes a human being again.
Oh, wow.
She loses her tail.
The doubleness is resolved. Yeah.
And dies and ascends into heaven.
Oh my gosh.
Her soul is immediately assumed into heaven in this folklore.
Oh, this is amazing.
It's such a beautiful, because so I talk to my clients all the time, right? I mean, and we've talked, the Lilies episode was just a sleep deprived free for all of theology of the body. But I mean, this is the major premise of theology of the body. And I've talked about this before, that really the heart of the Christian life is integration. Right. I mean, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says chastity is it's not just not having sex or not looking at people. Right. No, chastity is the successful integration of sexuality within the person, and thus the inner unity of man's bodily and spiritual being. This is the quote. Right. And so what do we need to rectify our own internal duality between our humanness and our wildness, between our desire to be good and pure beings on the surface and be monsters below the surface of our hearts? We need the body of Christ. And so giving the body of Christ to this mermaid turns her human. She surrenders her immortality, her earthly immortality, and ascends to a higher immortality in heaven. And that's especially cool because, I mean, you keep referencing Little Mermaid, right? Hans Christian Andersen, who writes Little Mermaid, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, is both a Protestant and a pedophile, and has a completely different understanding of spirituality than any of the people we would like or respect. And in his thing, like, mermaids don't have souls at all, right? Mermaids don't have souls at all.
Oh,
and
that's right.
Die and turn into sea foam. And that's why Ariel wants to be a human, is just so she can have a soul. So that's a really interesting thing, right? That actually we do have to talk about, because and no shame to our Protestant brothers and sisters, but it's just a fundamentally different philosophy of the human person, that there is actually, you talk about the difference between duality and dualism, right? There is actually dualism in that kind of Protestantism that says there is just the evil physicality and there is just the pure goodness of spirituality. And so Ariel, by giving herself over to the pure goodness of becoming a human, necessarily like has to die, right? And there's a separation there where with Saint Liban, no, she's receiving the Eucharist and she becomes complete again. The two parts of herself become reintegrated. And that is a fundamentally different perspective on sexuality, on the human person, on the anthropology of the human person. And it does, I think, to go full circle in this, add a lot more context to what you were saying about the way that mermaids are used to sort of depict sexuality and women, and is that sexist, and et cetera, and so forth. Well, it's coming from a very different perspective on sexuality, period, those depictions, where it's not saying, oh, look at the women, they want sex bad. It's saying this kind of fractured sexuality is as unhealthy as this kind of fractured faith in a sea priest or a mer monk, right? And it is Christ's job and our job as Christians to reintegrate those two things into a single thing.
That's so exciting. No, you're completely right. That's so exciting. And, of course, like, I wish I could just say, well, that was just that those problems are just found in some kinds of Protestantism. But of course, this is just a Christian problem, that right. They're always, because human integration is really hard, and is a kind of a lifelong project. There's always a temptation to just give it up. And so, and people will use their religion to as means to justify giving up the integration project and just settle for being disintegrated and make that for its own kind of virtue. And so, like, in Christianity, we would just call that dualism. This notion that, like, the body is bad or sex is bad or, like, whatever. Like, only the spirit is good. Right. And unfortunately, that can be found in various times and places, like, so throughout the Christian experience. But, like, you're totally right. And so, even some of these depictions of mermaids and stuff like this, yeah, they can come from this unhealthy place. But you're pointing out that this is the richness. This is the richness that's available here, which I think is stunning. And this example is so powerful. It's so powerful. And, like, what a powerful contrast with, like, not like, oh, do you want to like be a mermaid and, like, turn into, like, nothingness sea foam, or, like, do you want to, like, give up being a mermaid by becoming literally something else, different species, something totally that you aren't. This is like oh no, you are right now a person. You're just a vexed and a broken and a fractured doubled right. person where you should be one, and you've been doing very bad things. So we will, like, heal and integrate you, and, like, that's available for you if you want. You will have to stop being two things, though. You will have to start being one. And that's the most beautiful thing we could imagine, but you will have to stop being two things.
Right. And God, what a perfect.
Yeah, what a stunning instance. And that made me here, when I was thinking about like what I want to say on this podcast, one thing that I was thinking that occurred to me was like that the corollary to the mermaid is not properly speaking the merman, although as you pointed out, those exist, as do mer dogs, etc.
Well, even in the Nuremberg Bible that we started off with, I mean, there's mer women in the floodwaters and there's mermen in the floodwaters. So
yeah,
they do accompany each other the whole time. They
totally do. But like, I would think like philosophically or theologically speaking, the proper corollary to them would really be the centaur, because both of them, we touched on this a little bit, both of them have this dual. Because they're doubled creatures, both of them have a doubled signification. So like the thing about the centaur is that half the time when a centaur shows up, it's symbolizing, it is the best parts of the horse and the best parts of the man. So it's strong and powerful as the horse is, and it's wise and courageous as the man is. The other half of the time, the centaur is showing up with the worst parts of the man and the worst parts of the horse. So the horses are associated for a lot of Western European Christian history with lust, unbridled lust.
Well, and before, I mean, if you read the Journeys of Theseus in Greek, which you absolutely should, if you haven't, they're delightful because they are essentially a Western. I mean, like literally the Trials of Theseus are just a Western where Theseus wanders into a lawless town and he has to kill the one bad guy who's occupying the town. And then he saves the damsel and then says, "I can't be with you, damsel." And then just rides off in the sunset and does it again. Does it like 12 times. And
that's so good.
And 2 of these times, he's battling centaurs who are just raping everyone.
Yeah, because exactly. That's so that's thanks. So it is older even than that. Yeah, that's really helpful. Exactly. And it's the same way with mermaids. Is that half the time, they are this beautiful representation of kind of like the best things about, in a certain sense, best things of fish, and certainly the best things about women. So you're thinking about like. This is looking at it from the male perspective, right? The perspective of a sailor, but like think that you're looking out into the ocean, and you're looking out into a place where you expect to see only death and waste, right? Because the deep sea is really a place of like death and waste, and destruction. And instead you see beauty and love, right? That can live there, which is impossible, and it's stunning and it's beautiful, right? So that's like the half of the time, or some of the time, that's how mermaids show up, and it's the best of both, and then the other half of the time it's the worst of both, or the rest of the time it's the worst of both, that like they are in fact this bestial luring into the pit of death that holds up a false promise of beauty and love that in fact pulls the heart into the pit of despair, etc. So like I had thought myself very clever by thinking about this, like, I think that's how it is. I think that's that the centaur is the proper corollary to the mermaid because of this doubling and because of this different way. And then like it turns out that like this 14th century guy, Conrad of Megenberg, says exactly that. And the reason he says exactly that is because this 2nd century Greek text, the Physiologus, says exactly that the corollary to the mermaid is the centaur for exactly all of those reasons, which is great. So kind of obvious. But just like I bring it up in this context because like the point that you're making with the Saint Liban example that's is really pushing so hard on this fact of like, don't actually be too distracted by the fish or dolphin tail, or like are mermaids good or mermaids bad? Like, do they know what a fork is? Do they turn into sea foam? Like that you're right to press so hard on like,
what is a fire and why does it burn?
And why does it burn? Yeah, exactly. But the point here is this like, this horrifying, beautiful, perpetual crisis that is being a human person, which is, how do I become integrated? Like, how does it happen?
Well, and isn't this, I mean, obviously I've got my own psychological, spiritual, and folkloric issues with the Little Mermaid as written by Hans Christian Andersen. I mean, he was a disgusting human being, but
I had no idea he was that gross, by the way.
He was really a terrible person.
Awful.
But
okay.
isn't the Disney version of the Little Mermaid ultimately exactly about this? Right? I mean, we're joking, but when she's swimming around singing about, what is a fire and why does it burn? And what are these are, and maybe I'm getting a little bit too Christopher West here, right? But I mean, these are what Benedict XVI would talk about, like the desires of her heart, right? And they're being in her longing to be human and her longing to understand what the inklings of her interior heart, what that interior castle wants to recognize, but can't quite put her finger on. And it is through the integration of herself into a human as a result, not of her selfish desire, but ultimately loving sacrifice, right? She has to ultimately give herself up to try to save Eric in the end. That does integrate her and encounters her with, and that's kind of cool, right? That this totally unknowingly, totally accidentally, just by looking at mermaid folklore, Disney would sort of stumble into making a actually pretty damn good exploration of human desire and the motif of the mermaid that has been used to describe for so many centuries. I think that's neat. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that is cool. The thing that you're right, like that's sort of richer than you would think like 1989 was going to give the world, but
right.
Like, no, I think you're right. That's a helpful point. Like the thing that the Lee Bond story adds, which of course I'm not crapping on Little Mermaid for this, but because that's just not their thing. But like the even more powerful thing with the Lee Bond story is that, she isn't changing species, right? So this is like the little tricky thing with the Little Mermaids, because like,
right.
I want to be where the people are, because apparently she's not a person. Right. It's a little complicated. She wants to become something she isn't, So that's a little tough. But the Libana, of course, like she wants to become what she is, which is awesome.
She wants to be restored, reintegrated.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Like she doesn't know.
And because of the flood thing, let's even look at that further. What does she want to be? She wants to be returned to who she was before the flood.
Yeah.
There's this, I mean, her flood was the spring of Loch Ena coming up. But obviously when you hear a flood myth that ancient in regards to a mermaid, there's always a parallel being drawn to the Great Flood, whether you consider that in the Judeo-Christian tradition of Noah or, the sort of saga of Gilgamesh tradition. But these flood myths are everywhere, and she wants to return, be reintegrated to who she was before the flood. Essentially, who she was in Eden when she was perfect before she was, broken up by the flood waters that came upon at the, to rip Genesis and separate us from that kind of prehistory. So a lot of really cool shit here. I know that we are getting close on time. I can see you itching on one side of the camera, and I know that you want it, but there is just one more thing.
And I'm going to have one more thing too, because this is there's just too much with mermaids, but you tell me your one thing.
There's so much with mermaids here. Okay, well, you share your thing.
Okay, I'll do mine first. I'll do mine first.
It's going to be too wild.
I know. I have two last things that I want to share, but I'm only going to pick one of them.
Two? Okay, no, do it.
Are you sure?
I don't care if these episodes last a billion years. You're the one who gets itchy.
That's true. I do get itchy. I have ants verily into my pants.
Yes. And you're not even wearing pants. You're wearing a cassock, so that's difficult.
That's true. But what if I'm a fish monk? You don't know.
I am sure there are people who listen to this podcast and go, these hypocritical. I don't want to call out Catholic readers. There was one person. We've had such lovely reactions. God, you guys have sent us some of the most lovely comments that on days where we're really, really like struggling in, respectively. And, Father Gabriel with his studies and me with my dadhood and things that just have been such consolations to us. But there was one person, and I won't identify them, who, when we posted fake saints, I'm just like, I don't know why I waste my time with this sinful bullshit that we should be trying to be saints, not coming up with fake ones. And I'm like, I don't know what to say to you, man, but I'm pretty sure that individual thinks you're secretly a fish priest. So
I could be, technically speaking. If you've only seen me on YouTube, you've never seen my legs. Coincidence?
Oh my God.
I think not. Okay, so listen, I have two stories I want to tell you, and then I'll let you tell your last thing, and it'll be great. So one is that, like, if you've ever thought to yourself, like, over the course of this episode, like, wow, mermaids, you know, like, that's cute, but like the Middle Ages and, like, you know, Renaissance England and stuff like that, that's adorable, but, like, you know, we are too smart and too modern, and we have too many iPads for mermaids. Allow me to propose to you this example, this thing that really happened to me when I was shortly before I was ordained. I was taking one of my last classes, and it was this sort of advanced class in special topics in moral theology. So looking at difficult cases and stuff like this, and how do we think about them and think seriously about them. Some of the people in the class were it was just religious. Some of the people were priests, and some of them were about to be ordained priests. And finally, we're talking about some kind of particular issues and about this and that, marriage, sexual morality, all these kinds of things. And one of the priests in the class, who was from Nigeria, finally he was a lovely guy, you know, smart, capable, good priest, all this stuff. He just lost it. And he just said, like, guys, all the stuff you're talking, like, it's so, like, you these little nitpicky little things, like, it does, and he's like, and it just doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with real life. He said, like, you want to know what real life is? He's like, this is what real life is. Like, you tell me what St. Thomas thinks of this. And he's like, here is a real story that happened in my village. And he says, a man married a woman, and they lived together, and then after 3 months, he walked in on her, and her legs turned into a fish, and she swam away.
What?
Quote, her legs turned into a fish, and she swam away. What does St. Thomas say about that?
What have you now, St. Thomas? What sayest ye now?
This was a moment of complete cultural failure, a intercultural communication failure, because, like, I and all the other Americans in the class were just staring blankly at this guy, thinking, but I think probably for the best, not saying out loud, well, obviously he murdered her. Like, yeah. What do you want from me? Like, I mean, this is a tragedy, but it's not like a difficult moral case. Like, he murdered his wife. That's why she wasn't ever seen again. So what do you want from me? But no, I mean, he was genuinely, like, that was it. Like, we just had to, like, time out and just, like, move on to another subject, because, like, he was 100% certain that this was a thing, and it created a difficult moral case, which is that, can this man get married again? Because his wife's legs turned into a fish and she swam away.
Oh my God.
Can he get married again?
That makes me feel terrible. I hate to hear that. But also, I mean, very much like on the heels of what I'm talking about with the folk traditions in Irish folklore, right? Where they're saying, my wife has gone crazy. Is she a fae now? Right? That a lot of these things are often used to explain either mental illness or the really bad shit we did to someone with mental illness, or these types of things. And unfortunately, when you talk about folklore, I mean, it's not all fairies and tea time, right? I mean, there's some real dark shit on the underbelly of some of this, you know, because humans are dark, and you know, and there's some, I mean, we, you know, again, this is ultimately what mermaids symbolize, right? Is that darkness, that monstrousness, which can lie below the surface of us, that needs to be reintegrated. Yeah. It's interesting, though, that is a myth. The myth of the woman who turns into a mermaid and swims away. Very, very rampant in Selkie mythology. I mean, that's the central mythos of Selkies.
Yeah, right.
But it's also the origin mythos for the royal family of Luxembourg.
Stop it. No, it isn't. Yes. Tell me more. I love the royal family of Luxembourg. Yes.
Have you met any of the royal family of Luxembourg?
No, but very good friend of mine was once a special guest of the Prince of Luxembourg.
Was Prince Sebastian, or?
And this would have been in the 90s. I don't know. But he was given.
So that would have been their dad. I was tutor to Princess of Luxembourg, Victoria, for one night.
Did she turn into a fish and swim away?
No, we were both students. We were both in the same accounting class. The Crown Princess of Luxembourg was in the same accounting class as me. We were both failing accounting.
Good.
She was failing accounting 20 points lower than I was.
Ooh.
And I thought she was pretty. So I volunteered to tutor her for one evening. And she then quickly figured out that I was also terrible at accounting and never saw me again. But anyway, that wasn't my fault. The real culprit was the fact that she's a damn sea witch, because the origins of the royal family of Luxembourg, they trace themselves back to, let me see if I can find the names. It doesn't really matter. But basically what they claim is that, and this is this really, really common myth. This, king is riding along and he spies this beautiful mermaid and promises her, oh yes, here we go. Let's see. Oh, Count Siegfried of the Ardens.
Yes.
Right. And he marries this female water spirit, Melusine. Right.
Oh, this is sure.
Right. And so she's this beautiful nymph or mermaid, and she says, and this myth occurs and ends up becoming the Beauty and the Beast myth and all this stuff. But she says, one day a week was to be hers and hers alone, and her husband was never to intrude upon her privacy on this day. And this is the condition of their marriage, right? That she will be with him all the time, but on this day, he must leave her alone. This is apparently the day, though, that in secret she goes back into a tub and turns into a mermaid again.
Right.
And one day he disobeys that request. He comes in, he sees her, and she swims away, flees, never to be seen again. Right. So the entire family of Luxembourg historically and in classical medieval tradition trace their origins back to their great, et cetera, grandma being a mermaid. But this is another iteration of my wife sprouted fins and swam away, and I don't know what happened. And it must have been because I walked in on her at the wrong time kind of myth that unfortunately happens a lot.
Of course it does happen. But I had no idea, by the way, with Luxembourg, because the Melusina, whatever, is this exact myth in the particular shape that you're saying. Sometimes apparently there are some of the earlier versions. It's like, so it first appears written down, it seems, in a more kind of worked out form in like the mid 14th century. And for a while she's a snake. It's a snake. The bottom half is a snake.
Yeah. Snake or a dragon. Yeah.
Or this, but then it does becomes a fish or a dolphin, very clearly after not very long. And so but I had no idea that the royal family of Luxembourg traces their line specifically through Melusina. That's amazing.
Yes, that is the whole idea. Did you want to share your second to last point?
Okay, just one very last thing. This is, I swear, the very last thing I'll say.
My thing is actually big. My thing is actually a bigger kind of cherry on top of the sundae, so I want to end with it.
Okay, mine's simple. I'm just going to tell you right now, which is that. So this is important. Is that Jacob and his family live in Florida, which is really cool. And I just want to make sure that and that anybody, I know that most of the people who listen to this podcast live in Texas because Texas is the bestest. But if anybody else who listens to this podcast happen to live in Florida, and you say to yourself, like, I want to see mermaids without involving. I think
I know what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, good. Without going to like scary things happening in possibly abusive marriages in Nigeria. Hard to say. There is this place in Florida called Weeki Wachee Springs.
Yes.
And I just thought I could not let this episode pass by without talking just the teensiest little bit about Weeki Wachee Spring, because Jacob, in one of our earliest episodes, maybe our earliest, talked about how much he loved roadside attractions.
This was our first episode.
That was our very first
one.
The
spirituality of roadside Route 66 attractions.
That's right. So this is one of America's oldest and longest running roadside attractions. It's like, where is it? Like outside of St. Petersburg.
It's about an hour and a half away from me.
Yeah.
And it actually, to go full circle in this conversation, features really, really prominently in that museum that I opened talking about.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
They have vintage fins on display and stuff from this show. Anyway,
so what it is that this guy named Newt Perry, who was sort of a stuntman and was obsessed with it was a great swimmer and all these interesting things with the water. He founded this thing on had its first show on October 12th, 1947. And it was, so there's like a natural spring in the area, and then he built this big like underwater theater, he called it. It's quite deep. I mean, it's, I don't know, 20 or 30 feet deep, and then it's quite large. And then, but it's all glass down below. So like think, you know, you're in SeaWorld or whatever, you're getting to see the dolphins or something. But instead it's like pretty ladies, men too, but like pretty ladies. And he developed all these incredibly wild techniques for like, he built this airlock that's like down at the bottom of this like 20 feet, 30 feet deep of water. There's an airlock at the bottom, so you can like go into this place and breathe and then come out without ever going up. And they also would do this thing where people would be breathing through hoses and then like go the hoses and all that kind of stuff. But basically the point is that you do all these things and you stay way deep underwater for a very long time. You are coming as a tourist to watch people who are deep underwater doing all kinds of things for a very long time, including like, you know, drinking soda and like eating a banana and like throwing the...
It's very vaudeville, very cabaret, but sort of through kind of a underwater aerobics, kind of synchronized swimming. Sort of thing. Feels very Singing in the Rain
poses, and like they did an underwater Peter Pan in the 60s and 70s when they were trying to fight with Disney and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, and sometimes again, like you think about this, like is a mermaid a fish or whatever, but like it obviously got its start because this guy Newt Perry was like, well, nobody's really going to pay to see me, who's just kind of beefy, athletic guy, dancing around underwater, but they will pay to see like 10 beautiful like young women dancing around underwater. Sometimes wearing tails, sometimes just wearing legs.
The tails are beautiful though. If you ever get a chance to see these tails up close, I mean, they're made of swimsuit material, but then they bedazzle them with like tons and tons of sequins. And this gets us into a whole other thing, which I didn't expect to get into today, because we were just going to talk about mermaids and Christian art, but holy shit, did you just open the box? Because I'm a casual and observant fan of professional mermaids, which is like a whole thing. There's a huge subculture of professional mermaids, and they're amazing people because mostly what they do is marine biology education for kids. And a lot of them have marine biology degrees or just are very, very passionate about saving the environment. And you can look up like Finfolk Productions is one of the biggest ones that produces these things, but they will make these silicone tails that are all custom painted. They can cost, over $2,000 and weigh upwards of like 30 pounds or 40 pounds. I mean, just really heavy. And these men and women, mostly women, are Olympic level swimmers who will go off reefs, go into open ocean and swim with like whale sharks, all wearing these fins and filming it. And it is like the height of fabrication art in terms of building something beautiful and realistic looking that actually holds up under those conditions. It's the height of like athleticism. It's the height of academics in terms of like these women will just tour different aquariums across the country. Like when we were in Cincinnati together, the Newport Aquarium in Cincinnati hosted for 1 month, like 6 different mermaids just came in and swam with the sharks all day long in the tunnel and then would come out and like explain different fish facts to the kids. And I just, oh my God, dude, like, I just find that so cool. Just all the different types of art that are being hit there, just dance and acrobatics and sculpture and fabrication and painting and just incredible stuff. Look up professional mermaids, get into the scene if that sounds at all interesting to you, even from a weird kind of gandering place, because my God, is it awesome.
That's incredible. Cool. That's amazing.
So on my thing though, I want to take it back to the faith thing to close. And this is probably too long a thing to bring up. But it's normally your thing to throw in like a monkey wrench in the last 5 minutes of the episode and then get us off on a new path. So it's going to be my turn today. So we really haven't done justice in this episode. And I realistically, as a white American, only English speaking person, I can't do justice to this, but we haven't done even a glimmer of justice to the traditions of mermaids in Mexican Catholicism. But I do want to just, and it could definitely have an episode on its own. It should. But one of the other things that got me into this was, so I used to visit Mexico about once or twice a year. Since the pandemic, obviously that became less possible, but I did take my wife, to one of my favorite places in Mexico, for our honeymoon. And there's this beautiful sort of eco park in this part of Mexico that we go to that I actually want to do an episode on, that is in part dedicated to Mexican ecology, and in part dedicated to Mexican history, and in part dedicated to Catholicism. And it has two working Catholic churches on property, and it has a Catholic cemetery that has people from like over 100 years buried in it, all in what essentially amounts to a theme park. But you can make offerings, and it's very, very beautiful. And they say mass there every day. It's really amazing. But in the museum attached to the Catholic church, they have tons and tons of Mexican folk art, much of it religious, some of it not. And the most impressive piece, I turn the corner, I'm looking at, the little sculpted animals and all these things. The most impressive piece is you turn the corner and there is mounted on the wall, I want to say it's like 4 or 5 feet tall, this hand carved Madonna and child as mermaids.
Oh my gosh. They're both mermaids.
They're both mermaids. And they're surrounded by about 1,000 individually carved and painted fish, with 2 mermaids serving as angels underneath her, like singing.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
And I don't know why this image was created. But I was just so struck by the vividity of it. And I mean, just obviously the imagery being used, that I tried for this episode to do some justice to researching mermaids in Mexican Catholicism, and then pre-Catholic, pre-colonial Mayan and Aztec mythology. And I don't know if this is true or not. Perhaps there is someone who is a better student of this stuff than I am. I mean, this could be one of those like crazy, white people websites that actively makes up pagan gods. But there is this minor goddess in the Aztec faith called, and I believe I have this pronunciation correct, Chalchuquique. And she is essentially a mermaid. And she is the one who you offer this is where it gets cool. Okay. She's the one you offer your baby to during its first bath after birth.
Whoa.
So she's this half woman, half fish. She's a maternity goddess. And as you are bathing the infant, you make this offering to her. And so this author that I was reading makes this argument that this then becomes seen symbolistically as tying in, at least in an imagery kind of a way, to our reintegration in baptism. And once Catholicism becomes infused in this same worldview. And so Mary, as the integration of these things, becomes this mother goddess with the baby in the bath, in just some images and depictions from certain parts of Mexico. And that I really love as kind of a cap, because even though we're talking about, in the truest sense, Liban is probably the best exploration of what we're talking about here in terms of the reintegration of, she becomes what she once was. She becomes human again. There is something really cool to this idea of Mary as sort of the positive alternative to the siren who's calling us to her son, and us being drowned, not to die, but to be drowned and then born again. I mean, this is what we talk about with baptism, right? You are dying when you go into these waters and then you reemerge. And so there's a whole other way to kind of view the mermaid thing, where in one, you're viewing it as, okay, there's been a separation here of human and animal, and we need to reintegrate the human into its full humanity. But then there's this other angle you could view where it's like, yeah, we all kind of have to die and be reconsecrated up as mermaids, as these spiritual internal beings, as a result of the drowning. And here is this 4-foot gaudily technicolor virgin mother and child with gigantic coral crowns, and they have dolphin tails.
That is so astounding. And it does, yeah, you're right. I mean, so it's in the ancient church, you get all these ideas about the fish, right? There's lots of reasons why the fish becomes an early Christian symbol, but one of them is because
the main early Christian symbol.
Yeah, because we drown in the water, but now we can live there because we live with Christ's life. And I think about this,
we call out to others as fishers of men,
right?
Where, all these things, right? That the fish becomes very, yeah.
Yeah. And I think about this famous story about St. Francis, preaching to the fish, right?
St. Francis, I thought that wasn't St. Francis.
Is that Bernardine in Siena?
I thought that was, no, who was that?
Well, anyway.
There's that famous painting where the shark jumps out of the water to listen.
Oh yeah,
it's my favorite.
It might be Bernardine in Siena. I forget.
No, I'm gonna Google it right now because we're not gonna get this. St. Anthony.
Oh, it's St. Anthony. Sorry, it's the other.
St. Anthony preaches to the fish. Look up St. Anthony preaching to the fish, by Paolo Veronese.
Oh, Veronese. Oh my gosh, Veronese.
And it's literally just this giant shark popping out of the water like a goofy idiot, just being what'd you say about Jesus?
Hey!
And I love it so much.
It's so good. Oh my gosh, I mean Veronese is one of my favorite artists.
Oh wait, no, it's not Veronese. Who did this one? I will post it. I will post the one that I'm talking about. It is adorable. Oh, Arnold Bocklin.
Okay.
Arnold Bocklin does the one with the shark jumping out of the water and listening to a homily. And it's that. Now that is a back tattoo. I love.
That's hot. But you get that, right? Because there's also all this stuff in the book of Daniel, the Canticle of the Three Young Men about all you sea creatures praise the Lord, everything living on the earth praise the Lord, right? That there's this rich notion of the way that everything on the earth does praise the Lord in its own proper way. And so even that, all of this is kind of drawn in together, both this early church idea about, as you say, the baptized Christian as the fish who lives now in the water of death but doesn't die, and then this also also just about the fish also praise the Lord, and that Mary and Jesus just get to be there, which is great. There it's proposing, if I could put it this way, it's sort of turning the notion of integration that we were talking about earlier kind of on its head, which is to say that this is a kind of integration so deep that they are in both. It's because they're only half of each. It's not a kind of visual symbol that I would want everybody to be doing all the time.
Sure.
But it's a fruitful, they just say how do I want to communicate to somebody that that we live in what seems to be death and in what seems to be life. Well, here's one way to do it. And that is pretty splendid.
And I do also, I mean, because again, you can't separate out this sort of Sirenic idea of the mermaid calling and beckoning, right? And this idea of Mary, she's literally holding out her infant son as a mermaid. So what is she calling us to, right? And when we're being called by a mermaid, we're being called to at least in classical mythology, an insufficient fulfillment of our desire. But this mermaid is calling us to the fulfillment of our desire. And I dig that. I think that's hot.
I love it so much. All I can say is merman, pops.
Merman, father. It's a merman. Well, look, this is maybe my favorite episode we've recorded so far, because I think we've shown, or at least begun to demonstrate, just how widely you can interpret a single symbol once you have this sense of Christian imagination. So as we always do, I throw it out to you, the listener, whatever your chosen art form is, no matter how literal, right? Whether that's, drawing pictures with your kids, or whether that's, performing or creating art in some professional capacity, maybe use this as a creative prompt. What could mermaids represent or mean to you? What could you symbolize in your own spiritual experience, your own artistic journey through Mermaids? Take that, roll with it. Listen to that siren song, if you will, and go forth and create cool things. You've been listening to Creative Things, a podcast of Catholic creatives, hosted by Father Gabriel Torretta OP and Jacob Flores Popczek, produced by Jessica Flores Popczek and Kyle Meineke. To find out more about how you can support the podcast and other ventures for artists, visit catholiccreatives.org/support.